Hi, I want to do a movie on a slightly advanced topic called the exposure triangle. This is the science behind manual control of how bright the image is, right? If you leave it in auto, you pretty much don't have to worry about this. But if you want to move on to manual control and really take control, you need some understanding of how the camera controls brightness or darkness. This idea, the exposure triangle, is very common, but it's a little complicated. For myself, when I first started learning about cameras, I have to say it took me a little while to really get this. I had to hear it a few times, I had to play with it a bunch, and then finally it clicked. So in this movie, I just want to do my best to explain it. I'm not going to try to show examples, and there's an explanation in the book, and you're going to have to see this through the camera lens. But my belief is some explanation, some repetition helps with this more difficult concept. Also, before I begin, I want to note that this movie is not about the ND filters, which are very important. The ND filters are another way to control the light coming into the camera. We talk about them like sunglasses. And the ND filters are needed even in automatic functioning, right? There's no automatic for the ND filter. So when you're outside and it's very bright and you're like, I'm in automatic, I don't have anything to worry about. Not true. You still have the ND filters to worry about and use. So that's separate from this movie, but also affects the same parameters. That is the brightness. Okay, so let me show you the exposure triangle. Okay, so the exposure triangle is made up of three elements. The iris, okay, that is literally the hole, how big or small the aperture hole is to let in the light. The shutter speed and the gain are also called ISO. Okay, so the shutter speed is how frequently the camera pulses to expose the sensor. And gain or gain in video cameras called ISO in still cameras or DSLR is the sensitivity of the sensor itself. So I often think of this with the metaphor of the eyeball. If the ND filters are the sunglasses, the iris is obviously your iris, right? If you look at your eyeball, it opens and closes the size of the pupil to let in more or less light. I guess the shutter speed doesn't really have a parallel in the eye. It's just in a film camera, it was a physical shutter opening and closing. And it's literally how many times per second you choose to let in light. And then gain or ISO, I think of as like the rods and the cones, right? It's like literally having your eyeballs like turned up on the back of your eyeballs, like how much light are they receiving? Okay, so just a little more detail. That's what an iris looks like. So the vocabulary is the iris is that actual picture. The aperture is the hole in the middle. It's called the aperture. And the exposure is the amount of light that passes through. So exposure is measured in f-stops. If you see f12, f6, that is a measurement of how large a hole you're making. So these are not synonymous, iris, aperture, exposure, and f-stop, but they are all referring to the same thing. That is that iris and that opening. Okay, so shutter speed, as we said, is the frequency of exposure. Okay, the number associated with shutter speed is how many times per second the sensor is being exposed, or in film, the film is being exposed. In film, it was literally the opening and closing of a physical shutter to let in the light. But in digital, it's the sensor itself just kind of taking an electronic hit, capture, 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 90 times a second, 120 times a second, 60 times a second. Okay, so the more frequently that the shutter goes, the less light is brought in, okay? If you expose the sensor 120 times during a second, that is half as bright as 60 times during a second because the exposures are shorter. So the higher number is the faster speed, is the darker image when you're playing with shutter speed. And then gain or ISO is the sensitivity of the digital sensor. Called gain on video cameras and ISO on still cameras and in film, right? In film, you buy the actual film stock based on an ISO, based on sensitivity, and that affects the way the camera works. Okay, that's the science of it. Okay, three ways to control brightness. But the key to really understanding this is each one has another effect on the image. So when you start to take manual control, often you're adjusting these three parameters based on what you really want to get out of the image. I think of this in terms of trade-offs. So this is what I mean. Iris has a secondary effect on the depth of field. The smaller the aperture hole, the more space, the more vertical or z-axis space stays in focus. It widens the depth of field. You can keep the subject and the background both in focus with a very small aperture. Or with a very large aperture, you can create what's called isolation. You can shoot the person and throw the background into or out of focus to create that sense of depth or separation in the shot. So if you want a blurry background, a tight depth of field, you also want a nice big aperture. If you're worried about things going out of focus, there's a lot of movement and things going on, and you're worried about things falling out of focus, you want a nice small aperture. An easy way to remember this is that a traditional pinhole camera keeps everything in focus. Whatever light comes through that pinhole, it just is all in focus. There's no depth of field in a pinhole camera with no lens. Shutter speed adjustments affect the way the camera sees motion. In particular, a slow shutter speed will cause fast objects to blur. This makes sense, right? A slow shutter speed means it's expose, expose, expose. So in that slow exposure, if something is moving quickly, it won't capture a sharp image. It'll get that little bit of a blur. You might not want that. So when shooting sports or a car race, things with a lot of motion, you want it to stay crisp and not blurry. That's an opportunity that you might take control of the shutter speed for a fast shutter speed to catch nice, sharp images of motion. Now, remember, these are all going to affect each other. So if you go manual, these are choices. If you go automatic, it doesn't necessarily know how fast things are moving. So you might get that blur because it prioritizes, say, iris over shutter speed. But that's what manual is all about. The other thing to know about shutter speed, a little advanced, is this is the way that you can affect some problems with digital cameras that are generally known as a rolling shutter. If you've ever noticed when a camera, digital camera gets pointed at a computer screen, you'll see this rolling on the computer screen, this line that goes down the computer screen when it's being shot by a camera. That's what's known as a rolling shutter, and you have a similar effect if you've ever noticed under fluorescent lights. You may see a similar kind of like rolling band, especially on white walls. In both cases, what you're seeing there is that both of these things, the fluorescent light and the computer screen, have a frequency. And so if the frequency of the camera, the shutter speed, is sort of misaligned with the frequency of the refresh of the screen, it's off, and you see sort of the remnants of where it's capturing, but the screen's refreshing a little bit off, and you see that as that roll. Same thing with the flicker in a fluorescent light. So it's advanced, but what you can do is adjust the shutter speed to actually match the frequency, eliminating the shutter speed, the shutter roll, or rolling shutter. So finally, gain or ISO, when you pump that way up, it affects what's called grain in the image. You get a sort of texture across the whole image. It looks like static or snow. And this is not too hard to figure out. It's as we start to pump up the sensitivity, it looks into the black. It tries to find light even where there is none. And the effect of that is certain stippling. And I would encourage you, if you want to mess around with manual controls, to just close the lens cap and pump up the gain. And you'll see that black, no light become kind of like a muddy gray, a gray with a little bit of snowiness. So these are trade-offs. This is a balance. When you take manual control over the brightness of the image, you have to ask yourself, why am I taking manual control and what am I trying to achieve? Is it a nice bright day, but it's a car race? So what I want to do is prioritize the shutter speed, put it fast, and then move the other things so I get a correct image with a fast shutter speed to preserve the fast motion. Or is my goal some isolated focus, where what I really want is a sort of portrait or interview look where the person's in focus and the bookshelf behind them, it goes out of focus. Okay, I want to make sure to open up my aperture nice and wide and be careful with my focus. And I might have to do other things, like maybe even though I'm indoors, I have to drop an ND filter in so I can open up a higher aperture and get the separation that I want. I'll give one more example with gain or ISO. If I'm shooting outside at night and it's dark, but there are some interesting lights, traffic lights, brake lights, headlights, If I leave it on auto, it's probably going to see that darkness and push the gain all the way up automatically. That's going to try to see into the darkness, and you're going to get this kind of muddy gray where really it's black. And those nice lights are not going to punch through as well. Okay, it's going to kind of be gray, trying to make it look light when it's even dark. If you take control of the gain and push it down, you can get a much neater image, which is the traffic lights and the headlights really shining through on a more black or dark background. Further, you could play with the shutter speed. Maybe this is an opportunity for a slightly slower shutter speed. So you do get a little bit of the motion blur, but not the muddy gain. Okay, that's an overview of the exposure triangle. Again, I find this, at least I did when I was first learning, find this to be a challenging concept. It's in your book, so read up about it to review. And then when we move to manual control on the camera, start to experiment. You can also see on these cameras what it's doing in automatic. So if you just start to pay attention to, okay, it automatically changed my shutter speed there, you can just start to notice that and pay attention to this. Also, and this will be my last word, do not forget the ND filters. If there are three things in the exposure triangle, the fourth honorary one is the ND filter. And it's special because it goes in front of this. It's sunglasses that can affect the brightness of the image without having any of the trade-offs or side effects that I mentioned.